Great. You are now live, Dr. Reiff. Take it away.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second installment of Participation in Clinical Trial. This is a co-production of Lupus LA and Parexel. My name is Andreas Reiff. I am the Senior Vice President for Department of Immunology and Inflammation at Parexel, which is a company that conducts clinical trials worldwide, including clinical trials in systemic lupus. I'm glad that you found the time to participate at this seminar this afternoon, and I want to lead you through the agenda of today's presentation. Today, we will talk about what clinical trial and clinical research is all about. I will address a little bit the history of clinical research. Then we'll move on and talk a little bit about the life cycle of a medication from the lab all the way to approval. And then we move on to participation in a clinical trial, what it takes, where you can find out information about clinical trials, potential barriers and misconceptions you may have about participating in clinical trials. And I will also spend some time to typically address minorities in clinical trials. And at the very end, there will be hopefully some time left to answer some questions that you may have. So let's get started. So when we talk about research and describe what research is and what the clinical trial is really all about, it's a complex issue. The definition is essentially a systemic inquiry, collection and analysis and interpretation of data. That's really essentially what we do when we conduct a clinical study. So you may wonder, why do we even need medical research? We have so many medications already out there. Do we really need more? Well, here's an explanation. There are overall 30,000 known diseases in humans. However, only about a third of these are treatable at this time. The majority, about 70%, are not treatable and have no good treatment and no medications. That is one of the main reasons why we need to move forward with research and come up with treatment options for patients that have none. So why do we need clinical trials? As you can see on the left side of the slide, these trials are lengthy. They can take up to 7 years. They're quite involved, but they're important because during the conduct of a clinical study, we really want to gain knowledge and advance medical science. We want to know about the safety. We want to know about how a medication works. And we want to know how this medication actually improves the quality of life of patients like you when you use them. So what happens during a clinical trial? Well, a clinical trial is there to evaluate many different things. It's not just necessarily about a medication that you take or an infusion or an injection that you use for a particular disease. A clinical trial can also examine other things, such as methods for identifying risk factors that patients may have, ways of preventing diseases by taking certain steps in order to stop a disease from coming on in the first place, as well as explore and measure ways to improve the quality of life of patients with lupus just like you. So it's the latter point, I think, is quite important because there is always a new way to really assess how a treatment really impacts your quality of life. We have certain methods to measure that, but you may not necessarily feel that even though a score says you're doing so much better, that your quality of life is better. So that's a very important part of a clinical study. I have inserted this slide since the last presentation I gave a couple of weeks ago because I received a question from many of you saying, what actually happens during a study visit if I participate in a clinical trial? So this cartoon shows you a little bit about what can happen during a day when you participate in a clinical study. Typically, these studies start early in the morning, let's say around 8 o'clock in the morning. That's when you come into the hospital. You have to go into the parking lot. You have to check in on the front desk and then go up to the department, typically the rheumatology department, where the study is conducted. Then the study coordinator of that division typically brings you into the room. They check your vital signs, which is your blood pressure. They ask you certain questions, how you're feeling, and may give you some paperwork to answer that you can fill out while you're waiting for the study doctor to arrive. Once the study doctor arrives, you will have your usual exam that you might be used to from your typical other prior visit, but it's going to be more extensive. That you will be asked many questions about how you feel differently over the past 4 weeks, and there will be exam of joints and the entire body. After that, sometimes even before that visit, you may have to go to the lab to draw some blood and give some urine or stool samples. From there, you might be required to take an additional visit to the pharmacy, where you wait for some medication to be taken, or you go to the X-ray department where you may need a scan, like a CT scan, an MRI scan, or a chest X-ray. And if the intervention, the treatment for the study is an infusion, you may have to go to the infusion center where you're going to be sitting on a chair or laying in a bed where you receive this medication intravenously into the vein before you can then go home about an hour or two later. So, in other words, this can be quite a lengthy day. While your regular visits may usually be the length of 1 or 2 hours, a study visit can be quite a bit longer and can sometimes take many, many more hours, 5 to 6 hours a day. And that includes, of course, the time that you wait in the different departments until you are called. So let's get back to clinical trials as a whole. How many types of clinical trials actually do exist? Well, the answer is about 4. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. Phase 1 is the early phase of a clinical trial. That's usually when a medication is tested in healthy volunteers. Sometimes also in patients already, but these are smaller studies that essentially want to find out how a medication behaves in the body of a healthy human being. Once the safety and what we call the pharmacokinetics of a medication have been established in healthy people, then the study moves on into patients with a certain disease, like lupus. These studies then are becoming bigger in size, and now we are not just looking for safety and how the medication behaves in the blood, but also how it works for lupus and other diseases. Often, these trials are still being done with various doses. So a group of patients may receive a lower dose, another group may receive a little bit of a higher dose. Once this phase 2 is complete, then there's a phase 3 study. Phase 3 studies are really large studies, where we now involve several hundreds to thousands of patients. These studies are now the result of what we have learned in phase 1 and phase 2, and are usually done with a single dose. These studies are the pivotal trial, as we call it, or the decisive study that we need to file this study to the regulatory agency, like the Food and Drug Administration or the European Medical Agency, to get the approval for your doctor to be able to prescribe this medication. But frequently, these regulatory bodies will not allow this medication just to come on the market without an additional study. And that's what we call a phase 4 study. Phase 4 studies are done usually when a medication is already approved, but what it wants to test is how this medication now behaves in a real-world setting. So these studies are often lasting for several years and test these medications in different circumstances and different populations other than in patients that are in clinical trials. Some of these trials that I just mentioned can be handled as what we call a decentralized clinical trial. So what does that mean? Well, typically I showed you what can happen during a clinical trial study where you have to come to the hospital, see your doctor locally in the hospital, and all the exams that you need to do are done in a hospital setting. But lately, we have been trying to decentralize clinical trials. And what that means is that we can conduct some of these study visits from your home. So what that means is a study nurse might come to your home, may draw your blood at home. You may be able to connect with your doctor via a TV screen or computer screen and have your interview done virtually from the living room or from your bedroom at home without having to drive several hours to your local hospital where the clinical trial is done. Now, this may seem quite convenient for many patients, and it actually really helps to alleviate the burden of patients like you to participate in clinical trials. And we fully understand that. However, in the majority of these clinical trials, especially trials with lupus, we cannot conduct these trials all the way as a decentralized trial, meaning all of the visits that you will have are done from your home. Some of them are conducted as what we call hybrid trials, meaning some of the visits that you have are from your home, and others you have to come into the hospital. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the history of clinical trials, because when we talk to patients about participating in clinical trials, we often hear mentioning of, well, I know so many trials went wrong and people were experimented on and they didn't know what was happening to them. And that is absolutely correct. And that's why I wanted to address this a little bit in the following two slides. There were certainly trials done that were done not to what we would consider up to code at today's standards. Many of you may have heard about the thalidomide, the trials that were done. This was a medication that was helping women for their nausea during pregnancy, but then it caused severe birth defects. This was not necessarily explained to the women. During the Second World War, there were many clinical studies conducted on inmates, prisoners in prison and concentration camps that were illegal and certainly not in the understanding of the people that were involved. And as a result of all of these really tragedies that happen in clinical research, there have been several consensus meetings, one in Helsinki in the 60s and also in Belmont in the US in the 70s. And ultimately the formation of what we call the ICH-GCP, which is a document that regulates clinical trials very, very strictly nowadays. And so that it's very clear that clinical trials cannot be conducted without the full understanding of the person that is involved. And here I show you a few of these ethical requirements which were formulated by the United States National Institute of Health, the NIH. So today we cannot really conduct a clinical trial without having a social value. So meaning there must be some scientific research question behind a clinical trial and not just like, well, I'm curious if. Otherwise, they cannot be allowed. They need to be these trials need to be scientifically valid, meaning they have to have clear methods, clear numbers. They have to include a fair patient selection. So all patients are invited, not just the ones that are privileged or particularly vulnerable. And there needs to be a favorable risk-benefit ratio. So in other words, if there's any doubt that this clinical trial would create any benefit for the patient, it should never be conducted. Informed consent, meaning that every patient that participates in a clinical study nowadays needs to be well informed what the reason is, what the methods are, what the risks are, and what the benefits are before they enroll into the trial. And this has to be explained in clear language and easy language. And you as a lupus patient have to understand it. And I always say, please never hesitate to ask your trial doctor or whoever helps you with this informed consent to explain this until it's really clear to you what you are signing. Then there has to be an independent review, meaning that there needs to be a party outside the pharmaceutical company, typically, that conducts the trial, and you as the patient that oversees the welfare. And if there's any signal of something going on in that clinical trial, this independent body can then tell the manufacturer and the parties that are involved to stop the clinical trial. And there needs to always be the respect for the human subject, the human patient. You need to be protected, and you will be closely monitored during a clinical trial. Safety is always our priority. So let's move on and talk a little bit about the life cycle of a medication. Why is clinical research really so important? Well, a lot of this has to do with the fact that the life cycle of a medication, from the point when it's invented in the lab until your doctor can ultimately prescribe the medication, there's a really long journey. Drug discovery, so that's the point where people are still working on a medication in the laboratory, can take sometimes up to 6 years. Once it's finally out of the lab, it's usually tested in preclinical trials, meaning typically in mice or rats or other animal studies, in order to make sure that it is safe before it goes into the human clinical trial. And as I showed you before, these human clinical trials can take up to 7 years, all the way from phase 1, 2, 3. And then once phase 3 is done, the whole package is submitted to the regulatory agency like the FDA or EMA that I mentioned to you earlier. And that may take up to 2 years to review. They have so many studies to review that it takes a while before they sign off. And only then your doctor can ultimately prescribe this medication, and it's available to you as a patient. So it is not unusual that this whole cycle can take up to 15 years from the discovery in the lab all the way to the point where medication is approved. When you look at this also from another perspective, for every single compound that is invented in the lab, let's say we have 10,000 of these chemicals that are involved, or compounds that are invented in a lab, usually only one out of these 10,000 makes it to an approved medication. So 1 in 10,000. As you can imagine, that is quite traumatic. And you can also probably imagine what that means, how much money has to go into the development of such a medication before it actually creates a return of investment, if you will, for the people who have invented it. So there's a lot of risk involved, and a lot of medications, including medications for lupus patients, are sort of disappearing along that journey to the approval process. So let's talk about participating in a clinical trial. The way you have to look at this is you as the patient, you are critically important, and you are becoming a partner in a relationship that is the pharmaceutical industry that makes that medication. People like us in a contract research organization who conduct the clinical trial at your doctor's office, and the regulators, the FDA and EMA, that ultimately will approve this medication in the future. So again, why is it important to participate in clinical trials? Well, besides the fact that you obviously have a choice of medication that you can take, clinical research trials allow you to get access to medications that are probably more effective or possibly safer, but we don't always know that for sure when we start this. But you would certainly have access to cutting edge and the latest developments for your particular disease. You contribute to medical knowledge and research. You may potentially improve your quality of life, and you help others that are not in those clinical trials to benefit from you being in a clinical trial and helping them to make a decision. So here are the top 5 reasons why patients with various diseases choose to participate in a clinical trial. You would think that the majority of patients that go into clinical trials do that because, again, they want to improve their own health, their own disease. But in fact, it's really not the case. More than half of the patients actually participate in clinical trials because they want to advance medicine and medical knowledge, and they want to help improve the lives of others. Now, there are other factors that play an important role. Some people do it because they want to make some extra money. Now, paying money is not necessarily what we necessarily do in any clinical trial, but patients are certainly reimbursed for travel time, or they may receive some meal vouchers or parking tickets, these kind of things. But it should never, a clinical trial should never be conducted with money background. In other words, we do not want to coerce you financially to participate in a clinical trial. You need to do this out of your free will and not because you are financially dependent on it. A quick word on the minorities in clinical trial. This is a very important topic because clinical trials reflect diversity for decades. If you look at today's American society, 40% of all people living in America belong to a racial or ethnic minority. But when you look at how this is reflected in clinical trials, it has almost nothing to do with what we experience in the society today. 80 to 90% of all clinical trial participants today are white and Caucasian. And when you break this down by racial or ethnic minority, you can see that African Americans, for example, who represent 13% of the US population, only 7% are participating in clinical trials. Hispanics, 18% of the population, only 11% participate in clinical trials. And Asians, who represent about 6% of the American population, only about 2% of them participate in clinical trials. So why is this important? Well, again, if a medication comes onto the market, it needs to work for everyone, not just for a particular group of people. And we have learned over time that not all medications work equally in different populations. So especially when it comes to the Black or African American population, medications may have a very different effect and may work much less effectively than in a white patient, for example. So how come that the minorities are underrepresented in clinical trials? Again, there's a lot of reasons. We have talked a little bit about the clinical history, the history of clinical trials. Some of these trials were conducted, for example, in the African American population without their knowledge. So there's a certain matter of uncertainty and mistrust. Many of the minorities may not have the access to a subspecialist like a rheumatologist. And for some patients, there is no bilingual research staff available. So when we do consenting, so when you sign your informed consent to participate in a clinical study, it is usually required that this consent is done in a language that you understand. And again, if you do not understand what it says, because the language in front of you is not your primary language or you're not proficient in that language, you have the right to ask this to be translated in your language. And last but not least, it's the socioeconomic status of minorities that may not allow them to necessarily participate. As you have seen, these clinical trials might be involved. A study visit may be quite lengthy, and not everybody may have the time or the luxury to take 6 or 7 days off a day, including all the driving, to participate in a clinical study because you have to work, you have to take care of your children, and so on. So at the end of today's session, I want to quickly talk to you a little bit about how you as a patient could find out about clinical trials. So first of all, when you look, how do people generally find out about clinical trials? You would think that everybody says, well, my doctor told me about the study, but interestingly, that's not the case. In the majority of the patients, they get their information through the internet, through news media, TV, radio ads, through email advertisements, or newspaper and journal advertisements from research centers. Only about a quarter of all patients hear about these studies from their study physician or their primary physician or their nurse. So one way for you to find out about, let's say you're interested in participating in a clinical trial in lupus, is to go to a clinical site called clinicaltrials.gov, which you see up here in that left upper corner. If you type that into your browser, into your computer, you will end up on this site that you see here in front of you. So then it says here condition or disease, and then you can just type in lupus. You don't have to use any complicated words, just say lupus. And the system will automatically find you words like lupus erythematosus or systemic lupus, and you just click on that. Once you see that text, you click on that blue box on the bottom, which says search. So when I did that for you at the end of December of last year, there were worldwide 176 lupus studies that were actively recruiting patients to participate. And I put the breakdown here for you on the bottom. So 14 of those were very early phase studies. 38 were phase 2 studies, 25 were the larger phase 3 studies, and there were even 10 post-marketing studies. So again, when you click on that search function on the bottom, you will end up on a page like this. You will see a lot of different studies listed here on the right. But what I would recommend is that you filter them a little bit, and that you click on recruiting here on the left side. So you click on that box, and then you say apply. And then you will get all the clinical trials that are being conducted at this time. And then you can click on every one of them and can actually find out where are they being conducted, who to contact for this trial, who to participate. So in addition to clinicaltrials.gov, however, you can also find out about clinical trials on the Lupus LA website. There's currently one posting for one study on that website already, and you can read about this by clicking on About Clinical Trials at the Lupus LA website. But in addition, you will very soon find also some link to available studies for you that are coming from our company, Parexel, the one that I work for. And they will give you some additional options that you can choose, and it will describe to you what this medication is about and where it is being conducted and who to contact to participate. So now that we are at the end of our session, 4 tips that I want to leave you with. If you are at this place that you want to decide to participate in a clinical trial or not. First of all, discuss it with your physician. Even though your physician may not be a part of this study, it's always a good idea to discuss it with your rheumatologist and say that you heard about the study, that you would be interested in what he or she thinks about this. If you are concerned that your doctor may say, well, am I not good enough for you or anything like this, then discuss it with a family member or your best friend. See what they are saying and talk it through. Talk about it with whoever you think is a trusted advisor. This may be somebody from your local church, again, some relative that has some knowledge in this area, and be honest and open if you have any questions. Again, do not participate in a clinical trial if you're uncertain what it really entails. And with that, I want to thank you all again for the time that you spent this afternoon. And I think, Brianna, we might be open for a few more questions from the audience if we have any.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Reiff. And we do have some questions. The first question that we have in live chat is, what kind of tests are involved? How often are labs usually drawn to monitor what's going on during a clinical trial?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And the answer is, this is a little bit different than what you might be used to from your regular visits. Obviously, when you're participating in a clinical trial, again, our priority is your safety. So in other words, we may have to draw some blood work a little bit more often than what you would be used to. Typically, but this varies from study to study, these lab draws are occurring on a monthly basis, but it depends a little bit also on how often the medication is given. If a medication is given more often, we may have to draw blood at every single visit when you get this medication. Sometimes if it's given less, then it would be less, but it varies a little bit.
Okay,
The same probably is true for imaging studies. So if a study is in, let's say, arthritis, and we want to know how the medication works for your joints, you may have x-rays or scans a little bit more often than once a year, depending on what the protocol says.
Okay. Our next question is, can you usually continue to take your supplements while you participate in a clinical trial?
Yeah, that's a good point that frequently comes up. And again, it depends a little bit on the pharmaceutical company that conducts this clinical trial. Some of them allow it, others do not. It also depends on the definition of a supplement, because there is truly a wide variety of what people take in terms of supplements. There are certain medications. Let me quote you one example that we come across a lot. St. John's wort, okay, is one of these medications that help people with sleep and mood. And that this is a medication that may actually increase the metabolism, the degradation, if you will, of a medication in the liver of a patient faster than if you would not take something like this. So long story short, it depends a little bit about what the supplement is, and it depends a little bit about what the company that conducts the clinical trial would allow us to continue versus not to continue. But very good question.
Great. We have another question. Are you offering any one-to-one support during clinical trials? Should participants have any questions or concerns?
One-to-one as of your study doctor or myself as a person? Is that right?
I think are there typically individuals that you can contact throughout the trial with questions?
Yes, absolutely. So if you are signing up for a clinical study in a particular center for clinical studies, and this might be a big hospital, this may be a practice, maybe a research center, there's always a primary investigator responsible for you. That is the person that you would have to talk to. There's also always typically a study nurse or a study coordinator available to talk to. And in addition to that, if we are, let's say we are conducting this clinical study, there's also a representative of the clinical research organization involved in the conduct. And this is also somebody that you could potentially address for any questions. But yes, there's always a study team available throughout the trial that monitors you very closely and is open for questions.
That's great. And one more question. Does your doctor or rheumatologist have to approve your participation in a clinical trial?
Yes, that's very good point. Once again, I really appreciate the audience today. These are really sharp questions, I have to say. You know, I'm a rheumatologist. I have done clinical trials for over 30 years in my career. And I know this is sometimes can be quite sticky issue, right? Because, you know, your doctor may feel you're treated just fine, but you may not feel that good, and you really want to sort of push the envelope, but your rheumatologist may be a little bit reluctant. At the end of the day, and this is my personal bias, you need to do what's right for you, and you need to find the best way for your health to get better. If that's with the buy-in of your treating physician or not, it's ultimately your call and your choice. In an optimal setting, you would have buy-in from this person, even though, you know, your rheumatologist may not be part of that clinical trial because it's not done in his hospital or her hospital. But again, ultimately, this is really, it's your health, your body, and you should be comfortable with your decision. If somebody approves that or not, it's your choice.
Great. Thank you so much for your feedback, Dr. Reiff, and for taking the community's questions. We really appreciate your time today.
So Brianna, maybe we should mention that there will be another session coming up. That session will be exclusively dedicated to a question and answer session. So you will not hear the same thing that I talked about today, but it will kind of be an open dialogue for any questions or concerns you may have about participating in clinical trials.
Absolutely. On March 8th, everyone's welcome to join us. We're going to have a live Q&A with Dr. Reiff at 3 p.m. at the same time next Wednesday. And if you stay tuned to our social channels, you'll see details for how to join.
Wonderful. Hopefully seeing some of you there and looking forward to another interesting discussion. Thank you very much, everyone.